What is the overall goal of therapy? Is it to overcome some sort of mental health disorder or restore, to get back to some place that you ultimately kind of feel like on the inside that you can't ever really get back to? Well, in today's video, I'm going to talk to you about what I think is the ultimate goal of therapy for all of us, no matter who you are, where you come from, what sort of mental health issue or uncertainty or concern, or even if it is a disorder, what sort of disorder you're facing in life. Speaking as a counselor and a psychotherapist, I think that for me, one of the most important things to recognize here is what are the ultimate outcomes when we start to approach or have a think about speaking with a counselor or speaking with a psychotherapist. And in today's video, I want to speak to this very topic based upon the teachings of one of my idols, Carl Rogers. And I have his book, or one of his books, I should say, because he was a prolific writer. But his favorite book of mine is this one right here. I'll put it over here. It's called On Becoming a Person, a therapist's view of psychotherapy. And to me, this is not only a book that every therapist should read. It's a lot of his ideas will be discussed further if you're embarking on a journey into therapy, counseling, psychotherapy. You will learn a lot about his ideas, whether you're doing an undergrad or a postgraduate qualification, whether you're doing your master's, even if you're doing some research on it. His ideas about paraphrasing and minimal encouragements and empathy and unconditional positive regard, these have become staples in our industry, in the counseling and psychotherapeutic industry. But the reason why I'm speaking to you guys about it, if you're listening to this on the podcast or if you're watching this on my YouTube channel, and please let me know, if you are watching this on the YouTube channel, then you're probably going to be commenting. This is going to be like a weird thing to say. But let me know if you do listen to the podcast as well, because obviously if you've come here, if you've listened to me before, we do a lot of philosophy stuff and literary fiction stuff and psychedelia or meaning of life stuff too. But the reason why I'm speaking to you guys in particular today, even if you might not be a counselor or a psychotherapist or a prospective health professional, is because Carl Rogers' ideas about life, to me, are important for all of us, no matter who you are, no matter where you come from. So without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, so I've got a couple of quotes here that I really want to talk about first. And this one here is on, it's in chapter 2. It's how can I be of help? So he says that some of the outcomes that he has noticed with his qualitative analyses doing, because he was a scientist as well. He was an amazing psychologist and psychotherapist, but he's a psychologist in the sense that he actually studied and put a lot of his ideas to academic rigor and to the academic, I suppose, battleground, because it really is a battleground. If you get into academia, you realize that whenever you put forward a theory, it's often going to be debated against and sometimes even defiled. But that's what we want. We want some sort of like free speech, absolutist academic mentality so that we can all stumble towards a unified theory of the world in terms of the way things work. And when it comes to psychological research, that idea is obviously about the way how human beings work. So Carl Rogers was very, very humble. He not only grounded a lot of his ideas of psychotherapy in his own research and actually put it to the test, but he was more than happy to sort of play devil's advocate against his own work, because he just wanted to be there for the people he was working with. By a warm acceptance of and prizing of the other person as a separate individual, by a sensitive ability to see his world and himself as he sees them, then the individual in the relationship will experience and understand aspects of himself which previously he has repressed, will find himself becoming better integrated, more able to function effectively, will become more similar to the person he would like to be, will be more self-directing and self-confident, will become more of a person, more unique and more self-expressive, will be more understanding, more accepting of others, will be more able to cope with the problems of life and more adequately and more comfortably be able to do so. They were some of Carl Rogers' ideas about how effective therapy should actually reach its end goal, what its point B looks like. But the main thing I want to talk to you guys today about is this idea of moving from being a product into being a process. So Carl Rogers was huge on this, and what he would often see, and you can actually see his videos online, they're called the Gloria Files, where he's one of 3 therapists. So Albert Ellis and Fritz Perls as well, who was the founder of Gestalt psychotherapy. But Carl Rogers is one of those 3 psychotherapists who works with this very real client by the name of Gloria. And she takes her presentation to each of these 3 therapists. And in my opinion, if you've watched these, you can let me know down in the comments below. But in my opinion, Carl Rogers is the best by an absolute country mile. You see tears emerge from her eyes based upon how empathetic he is and just how much of a master he is at allowing someone to really feel that it's okay to be who they are when they're with him. And Irvin Yalom, who's also another one of my idols, said that the act of revealing oneself fully to another and still being accepted may be the major vehicle of therapeutic help. And that is an absolute classic definition, or a classic sort of reflective representation of what therapy is. And Carl Rogers absolutely offered that to his clients. But Carl Rogers thought that in the beginning, people come to him and they are a product. They are someone. They're very static. They're trying to overcome something. They're trying to get from point A to point B. They're sort of stuck in the world. But by the end, it's not necessarily the case that they overcome or completely complete or get rid of their ailment. But it's kind of like their ailment has been merged into a greater understanding of who they are as a person. So without speaking too esoterically here for the moment, I want you to have a think about your own life, and I want you to have a think about a moment in time where you were going through something really difficult, be it the loss of a loved one, a career change, a lot of anxiety about something coming up in the future. Perhaps it was what your boss might say to you at 9 a.m. on a Monday morning, or maybe something that your kids did, or anything that was grounded in sort of high expectations. You were really uncertain of the outcome. Can you see how in that moment you had the blinders on? You were very, very aware of where your point A was and where your point B was. I'm here and I want to get there. I want to get there to the place where I know I won't have to deal with pain. My child's going to be okay. My boss will still like me. I'll be able to manage my grief and not feel that it's overwhelming me day in, day out. You're a product because you're very static. This is who I am currently. Carl Rogers found that as time progressed and as the therapeutic endeavor began to really work its magic, he noticed that people became more open-minded. They weren't so much identified as a person trying to get from point A to point B, but as a person sort of floating through life. It was a lot more abstract. It was a lot more ambiguous, but people seemed okay by that. And there's a really wonderful quote here by the mythologist Joseph Campbell, who wrote that very famous book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. So this idea being that there's in every mythic tale, there's sort of like the tale of tales, which is you're somewhere and you're trying to get to a better place and you're trying to overcome and slay this dragon before you can bring the gifts back to society to rejuvenate society. And if you don't know much about Joseph Campbell, I highly recommend you read The Hero with a Thousand Faces. Also to The Power of Myth, which is actually a transcription of an interview he did in the 1980s. And it just sort of consolidates and synthesizes all of his amazing ideas from studying myths all across the world, across time and space, for decades. So I highly recommend you get into Joseph Campbell if you haven't already. Joseph Campbell's quote was that the psychotic drowns in the same waters within which the mystic swims with delight. To me, that's exactly what Carl Rogers is aiming at here. It's this idea that in the beginning, you're trying to get out of this pain. I'm starting to drown. I can feel myself drowning. I need to come up for air. I'm feeling really overwhelmed. I'm point A. I need to get to point B. And then once I get there, then I'll be happy. Then I'll be complete. Then I can rest. Then life will be good again. But you notice that when it comes to Joseph Campbell's quote, the mystic or the enlightened one or the sage or the shaman hasn't actually changed his or her location. He's just become more acceptant of it. He's surrendered to the water. So he doesn't feel like he's drowning in it anymore, but he's actually swimming with delight. Now, to me, that is a perfect example of what the therapeutic process is all about. Now, I know I'm biased because as a therapist, I work primarily in the realm of relationships and the realm of existential concerns. And within those two realms, there's not actually a whole lot that you need to overcome. It's not like we're specifically trying to work through a phobia or an anxiety disorder where we sort of expose you progressively to the thing that you're afraid of, whether psychologically or actually physically. And you get to the point where you no longer are afraid of that because we've been able to bolster your bravery. You've been able to become more courageous and you feel like you don't have this disorder that's just plaguing your life and preventing you from living in a functional way. Well, when it comes to existential concerns and relationships, what we find is that there aren't necessarily problems to solve or issues to overcome, but rather dichotomies to manage. So you can think about within a relationship, for example, when let's say you and your wife or you and your husband are having an issue and it keeps popping up and keeps coming up and up and up. What you'll notice, especially if you do couples therapy, is that these problems or these differences of opinion actually represent characteristic differences. So if I win and if I get my way, then my partner loses. But if she gets her way, then I lose. So what we really have to do is not try to find a solution, but rather accept that the solution is going to be within compromise. It's going to be within trying to find the best of both worlds, because we can't ultimately arrive at a place where both of us are perfectly happy. Now, this is the same for existential concerns, and existential psychotherapy is a pretty significant faction within the psychotherapeutic space. And it comes from a lot of Dr. Irvin Yalom's work, who was a brilliant psychotherapist. In fact, I actually have one of his textbooks here. This is one of my favorite books as well. This is called Existential Psychotherapy. Now, it was written in the 1980s. In fact, it was written in 1980 when the whole psychotherapeutic worldview was still heavily predicated on the unconscious and on Freud's ideas, and not so much Carl Jung's ideas about the collective unconscious. That was a slightly more woo-woo or esoteric viewpoint, but Freud was really, really big on ensuring that his ideas were a science. So the psychotherapeutic worldview was all about the unconscious. So you'll notice that if you do read this, and it is a really big book, so I recommend you sort of break it up a little bit, but if you do read it, you'll notice that a lot of what Irvin Yalom was speaking to was about repression and denial and sort of the infantile stages of lifespan development, which we still use in this day and age, but today a lot of the psychotherapeutic worldview is now more grounded in solutions-focused therapy, more positive psychology. Childhood trauma is obviously a big one that we see this on social media all the time. And we see some of the unconscious sort of rearing, not to say it's ugly head, because I actually really love those ideas, but you see some of it popping up, but it's more sort of in the spiritual world. And that's not to say that the unconscious plays a giant role in how human beings function, because as we all know, basically 95% of who we are is subconscious processes and habits, and then unconscious things even lower than that, right? But what we are trying to do is sort of augment and emphasize agency so that we can take some of life's difficulties into our own hands and actually seek positive solutions ourselves. But the cool thing about existentialism, at least in my perspective, is that when you're dealing with someone who's having major existential concerns, be it their fear of their own mortality, pains about aloneness and feeling lonely, and not necessarily because they don't have friends, but because they feel that no one truly understands what it's like to be them. The pains of meaning and feeling like they have a lot of responsibility in life, but the more responsibility they take on, the more they feel that it's a burden, almost like happiness is something that has to be fought for and not a God-given right. And then obviously the final one being, like I said before, meaning, this feeling that we live in a world without inherent meaning, when all of a human being's requirements are sort of set up to seek meaning and find meaningful things to value, so that we feel that our life is worth something and actually has value. All of those ideas, those four givens, those four preconditions of the ontological human experience aren't or do not have solutions. We can't overcome these things because we're thrown into a universe or into a world that these are kind of the rules. So we just have to learn to accept them and surrender to them and find ways to manage around them. And coming back to Carl Rogers, this is what Carl Rogers was saying. He was saying that over the course of effective psychotherapeutic treatment, what you will start to see in a human being is that they are no longer so outcome oriented. They become process oriented. They recognize that a lot of their pains and their ailments and their issues and their disorders and their concerns won't ever really ever go away. They'll just sort of merge into the river. They'll sort of fall back into their experience and they'll befriend them. So they'll sort of be able to surrender to them and see them as friends rather than as problems to overcome, which lends itself nicely into the relationship realm as well, where you start to, and we all know the cliches about, we start to fall in love with our partner's imperfections. We start to see the things that we used to think of as annoying and we become bitter and resentful about, we start to miss them about, especially when people die. You know, our loved ones died. I've had the privilege of working with a lot of people who have been in bereavement and have been grieving their wives and their husbands or their girlfriends and their boyfriends for sometimes decades. What they will often say to me is that they miss the imperfections, they miss the burps, they miss the farts, they miss the funny little things because no one did it like them. So another one of my favorite quotes in the book on Becoming a Person by Carl Rogers is on page 119, where he says that, quote, "Consciousness, instead of being the watchman over a dangerous and unpredictable lot of impulses of which few can be permitted to see the light of day, becomes the comfortable inhabitant of a society of impulses and feelings and thoughts which are discovered to be very satisfactorily self-governing when not fearfully guarded." What Carl Rogers is saying there is that the mind is basically like an ecosystem. So you can think of the mind as like a group of really passionate belligerent politicians, and they're all trying to get their voices heard. And this sort of speaks to some of the ideas associated with internal family systems therapy, where each of the little things in the mind, it's an unconscious idea, it's a psychodynamic idea, where each of our feelings, each of our thoughts, each of our impulses represent different parts of who we are. And what we really want to do as the being that controls all of these different little parts is we want to accept them in the same way that if you sort of push down one political viewpoint, it's going to pop up 10 times harder. And that's why you get crazy people on the left and crazy people on the right who just don't feel that they're being heard and seen and validated and loved. All of this is so psychological, right? But they don't feel they're being heard and loved, so they start to get angrier, and then their political opinions become more extreme, and then all of a sudden you see all the bullshit that's going on in this day and age. Well, what Carl Rogers is saying is basically we need to, within our own minds, and then obviously on the political front as well, we need to get really good at accepting all of these different parts of ourselves so that we can befriend them. We can surrender to the fact that they are with us, whether we like it or not. We all have the proclivity to be disgusted by people, to judge other people, to be really mean to people, to be really sad in a condescending and patronizing way. But we also have the proclivity for being beautiful, wholesome, loving, empathetic individuals. And what we want to do is not suppress just the shitty stuff to cling on to the good stuff. What we actually want to do is befriend and love all of it so that all of it can be seen as rather lovely. And in doing so, we will be satisfied with who we are fundamentally, recognizing that we can't get rid of some of these things that we don't like. But that's not the goal of therapy. The goal of therapy is to actually accept these things so we don't want to get rid of them anymore. We actually enjoy having them with us. We see them as parts of ourselves, just like we are happiness and we are laughter and we are humor and so on, but we're also sadness and depression and grief. This is the whole spectrum of human emotions. And if we can fall in love with all of it, or as Ram Dass says, if we can embrace the 10,000 horrible visions and the 10,000 wonderful visions, then we'll become the one that witnesses and sees everything that is a part of a human experience. So to me, you have to read this book. Whether you are a therapist, a counselor, a psychologist, whatever you are, a healer, even if you are not, if you're just a person who loves motorbikes or cars or knitting or really nice Italian sauce, whoever you are, to me, this is one of the most important books that you can read to help you become a person, to help you become who you are so that you can accept yourself in a more loving way and not in some sort of bullshit, fake, disingenuous, self-esteemy way. So you can really, truly love who you are and find out how to live your life in the way that works for you and see the world as a playground. If you have any questions or comments about Carl Rogers and existential psychotherapy, Dr. Irvin Yalom, please, I want to hear from you. Let me know what you think of those ideas in the comments down below. Reach out to me if you are listening to this on Spotify, and I will absolutely 100% speak to you soon. I've got some really exciting podcast guests coming up, by the way, and I cannot wait to share that content with you. I'll talk to you soon.